One day, a gate appeared in the world. A similar phenomenon is observed in every corner of the world, a ubiquitous phenomenon that is harmless to the human body. But their exact purpose was never revealed, and the number of citizens expressing concern continues to grow. Meanwhile, in scientific circles, everyone is trying to figure out whether this phenomenon is connected with the unfortunate appearance and disappearance of monsters. Somewhere the loaders must have finished loading. The woman told the man that this was the last kitchen set, and she had a box in her hands. The man replied that there was still time, so they could take a break. The woman turned around and asked someone if he heard. The young guy, holding a box on the relay, answered that he understood. The man then asked the guy's name again. His name was Eugene, and then repeated it again, to which he said that he had just moved the last box. The man then threw a bottle into the boy's hands and asked him if it was hard for him, and the woman noticed that the young man was so diligent and how strong his hands were. Eugene only laughed awkwardly in response, opening a bottle of water. The man asked the guy why he was working there, whether he needed to pay for college or something, to which Eugene replied that he was paying for his brother's education. And then he said that their parents died early. They only had each other left, and therefore he had to drop out of university and go to work. The woman exclaimed that so much suffering had befallen him. The guy said that there was no suffering, and then took out his phone, showing a photo of his brother. The woman noticed that the guy's brother was so handsome and neat, and Eugene said that he was also taller than him. And then Eugene began to praise his brother. Eugene chattered enthusiastically as he talked about his brother, and the man remarked that he always became like that whenever his brother was mentioned. Eugene smiled happily and said that his rank classes were ending today too. That's why after work he will immediately go to his place to eat meat. Meanwhile, Eugene's brother was sitting by the window on the bus. He looked out the window, where the sun was already setting. Above the bridge one could see those very gates. Eugene said that work increased due to moving, and then he said that it was all for the prosperity of his bosses, and the woman noticed that he also spoke beautifully, and the man said that it was all because of that thing and looked out the window of the truck. Eugene also looked out the window asking what that thing was, and the man said he was talking about that thing, and pointed his finger at the gate. She said that many people are now moving because of this thing because it makes them sick. I would like to know what it is. Leaning out of the car, Eugene noticed that his brother said that he had also seen some of these on his way to school. The woman asked if it was something good, if it was worth buying a house here. The man and woman continued to talk, but then Eugene raised his head, and he asked if it had always been that color. As it turned out, the gates were now glowing red instead of the usual blue. And then the truck suddenly stopped abruptly. The man and woman immediately wondered what it was, and whether someone had crashed into them. Eugene hurried out of the car to check his things. As he got out of the car, he noticed that there was some kind of bird-like creature sitting on the truck, drooling from its mouth. Noticing her, Eugene froze in shock, and the bird turned its gaze to him. And then she screamed loudly, and then hurried to run straight into the guy. Eugene managed to dodge, falling onto the asphalt, and the monster crashed into the car, tearing off the door. The monster climbed into the cabin and attacked the people in it, causing them to scream in fear. The screams continued and Eugene sat on the ground, unable to do anything because of fear. As it turned out, these monsters were flying out of the gates, causing people to run away in panic. It turned out that the gate was connected to the dungeon, another world, through which monsters from it entered the world. An uncleaned and abandoned dungeon bursts when it reaches overflow. Dungeon break. The moment when the dungeon breaks and demonic beasts come out, and in a state of simultaneous dungeon strikes, only in their country hundreds of people were injured. Many died. Eugene jumped to his feet and grabbed some kind of iron rod. Coming closer, he shouted to the lizard to come out of there immediately. He was about to threaten her with his stick, but then he noticed something. As it turned out, someone's strong hands were squeezing the monster's jaws, and surprisingly, it was Eugene's boss. The woman screamed at her husband to take advantage of the moment and get out, and the man asked what was wrong with her hands. The woman replied that she didn't know either. The power appeared on its own, and people appeared who were awakened and had abilities when confronted with monsters. They became monster hunters. They were the ones who were destined to clear out dungeons. Hunter soon became one of the most sought-after professions. Meanwhile, that same monster was lying on the bridge, and his entire body was on fire. People watched someone with awe and shock. A young man stood on the bird's corpse, his shirt tattered. A pitch-black flame was burning from his palms. As it turned out, it was on this day that Oliver, Eugene's brother, became an S-class hunter, of which there are only a few in the world. 8 years have passed since that day. The girl raised her hand, and a green glow shone above her palm, in which one could see circles, and she asked if they saw anything. The reporter said she couldn't see anything, and the girl replied that it was a state window that only she could see. She said she first wondered if she was in a game, and then she said that in this status window there is a list of skills that she can use, and then she pressed her palms to the floor and roots began to creep out from her hands in all directions. The trees spread out across the room, and the reporter asked if she really used this ability to save people. The reporter said that 8 years ago during the dungeon the girl was looking for work. Awakening her wooden vine skill, she saved the citizens from the falling building. The girl laughed and said that she was in a hurry and somehow didn't notice. She continued by saying that she later chose the profession of a hunter and now clears dungeons as part of a small guild. Another woman said that the extra items she gets from dungeons also cost money. It's a bit dangerous, but it's better than any other job. And A-class dungeons can be considered a goldmine. New material from dungeons that did not exist in the world before are magic stones. Their cost ranges from several hundred to several billion. And hunters get good money for these stones, especially for stones from high-ranking dungeons. Especially famous in their country is the hunter Oliver, who was still a schoolboy at the time of the awakening. He lost his parents as a child and grew up in poverty, and after awakening, he founded the Abyss Guild and takes the position of the youngest guild leader. He is currently 25 years old and is said to be in a state beyond imagination. The reporter asked the girl if she had also become rich, to which she replied that she was only an E-class, and then she said that if she continued to work she would save up and she would like to save money for the education of the younger ones. This was the last interview of this hunter. She died while clearing the dungeon. She was taken to hospital at dawn this morning but was unable to recover. The news said that as attractive as the job of a hunter is, it is also dangerous. The guy sat with his head down on his knees, empty bottles of alcohol scattered around him. Meanwhile, a crowd of people had gathered near the next gate. Some guy called a man and then asked him why he brought such a man with him. As it turned out, he was talking about Eugene, who was an F-class hunter, nicknamed the Educator. And there were crutches lying next to him. Removing the mask from his face, Eugene noticed that he was famous, and then he told the guy to be lenient, because this is what he does for a living too, but that didn't soften the guy. The man put his hand on the boy's shoulder and said that few hunters would respond to such a small reward. But the guy replied that he was a magnet for trouble, because everyone else who was with him died. Eugene began to rub his hands nervously when the boy said that he was even abandoned by his incomparable younger brother. He went to his phone to find an article that said he never even visited him once when his leg was ground into powder. But then Eugene rose to his feet and grabbed the guy by the collar, and then he told him to shut up already. With wild eyes, he said that it was none of his business or anyone else's. The guy raised his hands and asked Eugene if he was angry, and then he kicked him in the chest, asking where he had lost his fear to attack like that. And now Eugene found himself grabbed by the collar. The guy asked him if he felt a difference in strength, and then he said that some F rank doesn't dare to bother him. Throwing Eugene to the ground, he told him to complain to his brother if he was so offended. Sitting on the ground, Eugene raised his hand, clearing his throat. Then someone raised a hand to him, from which yellow magic circles appeared. The man's hand glowed over Eugene's knee as he began to heal it. He said that he strengthened the frame, this is his ability, and although he cannot cure his leg, he will be able to move it easily for a few hours. And then he told the guy not to take those words to heart because it was absolutely pointless. The man continued by saying that he was an F class, so he would have to rely on someone one way or another, and so he just had to be patient. And in response to this, Eugene raised his head and smiled brightly at the man. Taking the man's hand to help him up, the boy said he was already grateful that they were taking him with them. Eugene said cordially that his boss was working so hard to reconcile them all. In response, the man smiled awkwardly, thanked her, and said that, as expected, he was the only one who noticed it. Eugene simply looked at the man's face with a smile, but he himself thought that he had been caught. Eugene began to rise to his feet. He lowered his hand to pick up his cap that was lying on the ground, and suddenly screams were heard somewhere. As it turned out, it was the man who hit the guy on the back of the head who was bullying Eugene, shouting at him to stop it, because Eugene is insanely fast, and he is familiar with dungeons firsthand. Leaning on his crutches, Eugene raised his hand a little higher, and a blue hexagon lit up above his palm, and the guy mentally used the subject upbringing check. A window appeared above the man's head, stating that guild leader Scott had been added to the training targets. The guild had already set off for the dungeon, and Eugene, approaching closer, thought that all these nicknames might be true, because he had always survived thanks to this skill. The men entered the dungeon, which looked abandoned for a long time, with vines growing along the ancient stone walls. From the depths of the room, monsters that looked like bats suddenly flew out. People immediately rushed to attack, attacking the monsters with explosions. Some defended themselves with a shield. At the back were people with support abilities who healed and strengthened others from afar. Someone said that they shouldn't let their guard down, to which someone else replied that this was a D-class dungeon, and that someone incredible couldn't possibly come out of it. There were already dead monsters lying on the ground when someone said that before they would shudder just from the sight of such creatures. The monster's body suddenly dissolved, leaving behind a small glowing stone that lay in a pool of blood. Scott picked up the stone, noting that he didn't expect them to earn that much. A guy came up to him and said that with that size, even a D-rank stone would be expensive. And then he called out to Eugene, who was mining with a pickaxe, and he reminded him that 80% of his production would go to commission. Eugene turned around holding a small stone in his hand, and he said that there was nothing more serious than this waste. To which they replied that the magic stones of their monsters were their prey, and if he did not want to die of hunger, then he should dig hard. Eugene felt like he was Cinderella being ordered around by her older sisters, and the boy continued by saying that if he was caught hiding anything, he would be stripped naked and hung on the pillory. Still, Eugene began to diligently hammer his pick into the stone, cursing and saying that these bastards were treating him like cheap labor. He started singing to amuse himself, but he sang about how he was no different from Cinderella. The boy stopped, sadly singing about how he was a young orphan. And then he thought that he had lost his parents. Even his younger brother had turned away from him, and after waking up, he left home. And he didn't listen to him when he asked him to stop, when he said that it was dangerous. And while Eugene was in the army, his brother Oliver gathered hunters around him and created the Abyss Guild. As the Abyss became recognized as the strongest guild in the country, Oliver became more and more unattainable, and the abandoned Eugene was left behind. Eugene's head was filled with thoughts of what might happen if he, too, awakened as he wanted to awaken. Having spent all the money he had left after quitting his job, he found a broker who promised to wake him up. He fell for their flattering promises that they would take care of him since he was an S-class brother. He did a lot of dirty deeds, after which, although late, he woke up, but he woke up only as an F rank. People began to whisper, discussing the fact that Eugene had been knocking on doors, begging to be accepted into the Abyss. Someone told him that they believed him. Since he called himself the elder brother of the Abyss, they supported him, so now he must repay them everything. Eugene's name was now constantly on everyone's lips in the press, and he himself found himself in debt. Oliver, coming to him one day, asked him how long he would make him clean up after him. He said that his nickname, which he received upon awakening, was Educator, because he educated the S-class. Oliver asked him if he was ashamed of such a nickname. Leaning towards his ear, he said that he was not a teacher, but someone who only bound his hands and feet. Eugene was injured time and time again in the dungeon. He could no longer even use his leg, and Oliver refused to help him, providing the help of a doctor. Oliver said that everything should work out well, because he won't encounter any more troubles in the dungeons. Turning around, he asked his brother to live quietly from now on, and to stop tying his hands and feet. Meanwhile, Eugene, lost in his memories, hit the ground with his pickaxe. A blank expression appeared on his face as he stopped and stared at the ground. He sighed and quietly said that he deserved to be abandoned. After all, he is the feeble older brother of a magnificent S-class hunter. He is a parasite trying to extract all the benefits from him, and this is not a delusion. And the fact that he is F rank, always surviving in dungeons where people constantly die, is not his merit. It is only due to his skill that he extracts benefit from others. The ability given to him upon awakening allowed him to influence those around him. He could influence those who were as close to him as his own family member, whom he personally cared for and raised. But he could also influence people with whom he met and became friends. If he applies his code word to such subjects, they become his pupils. And then he could add small enhancements to his pupils, which was his main skill. Eugene wondered if he could possibly survive with something like that at the bottom, even if he was a pure support. He's just a cave grasshopper, a parasite who survived alone even when all the other members of the team were dying. But he survived not because he was lucky, and not because he was in the rear. In fact, the educator has another hidden skill that has saved him in every crisis. Suddenly, a notification rang in Eugene's ear, informing him that the effect of the educator title was being activated, and the additional skill, Final Retribution, was being launched. The guy didn't expect his skill to work, but a message immediately appeared stating that the skills and abilities of the object of education are transferred in double volume. And the guy's hands, which were holding the pickaxe, suddenly glowed with a bright light. Eugene looked at his hand and realized that power was flowing into his body. And this was precisely his boss's ability. A magic circle glowed above his palms, indicating that it was an enhancing ability. Eugene threw the pickaxe on the ground and grabbed his crutches, and then he quickly ran forward, not understanding how this was possible in a D-class dungeon. The hidden skill, Final Retribution, means that the abilities and skills of the pupil that was improved by him are temporarily transferred to Eugene with double the power. If his speed was 100, now he can run at 200. It is thanks to this skill that he constantly survived. Eugene stopped, stepping heavily onto the ground, and he thought that this was an incredibly bad skill. He opened his skill menu, and this skill was difficult because of the condition of its activation. After all, the condition for activating this skill is the death of the object. And since this ability has now been activated, that means Scott should already be dead. Eugene walked forward again, and his foot stepped on something red. Looking up, he saw Scott's lifeless body lying on the ground, with blood all around. Someone's screams were heard, which made Eugene turn around. As it turned out, these screams belonged to the guy who had previously bullied him. But now this guy was in the mouth of one of the heads of a huge lizard. But the guy was still alive. Even though his arm was torn off, he weakly said that it was impossible, because it was a dungeon of rank D. And then he cried out that it was all because of that bastard. Because of his bad omen, all because he got involved with him. And then the monster's jaws closed, breaking the guy's bones and tearing his flesh, causing him to let out shrill screams and his blood to flow down. Looking at the monster, Eugene thought that it was the king of poison and curse dragons, Rauchitus. Until now, no one has been able to defeat him because he belongs to the genus of dragons of the first class, meaning that elimination is impossible. What is such a monster doing here? Noticing a new victim, one of the dragon's heads darted towards Eugene, but he managed to run away, and therefore the monster's teeth only tore his jacket. The guy quickly used the leg enhancement ability, and his legs glowed with a bright light. And now he ran even faster, managing to break away from the monster by running into some kind of crevice. As he continued running, he thought that this was a boss enhancement skill, and now it had a double effect. He decided to use this speed to hide where the dragon could not enter. He decided to escape at any cost. But then the dragon decided to clear a path for himself, and he, waving his tail, broke the stone, stopping the guy. Eugene stopped just before the edge of the cliff that had been created by the impact. But the dragon did not calm down, and growling loudly, he was about to pounce on him again. Realizing that he had nowhere to run, Eugene decided to try to block the blow with his crutches, strengthening his arms. However, this was not successful, and the guy only quickly flew away, and his crutches flew in different directions. He fell head over heels to the ground, making a strangled sound. Blood began to drip onto the ground. The guy's body shook as he looked at his hand, which was covered in his blood. He thought that he was no match for this dragon, even with twice the skill strength of the boss. The guy began to be overwhelmed by his dying memories. He saw how the guy turned to the boss to say that he would try to buy time. But he didn't have time to finish speaking, and the dragon hit him with its tail, spraying his blood in all directions. Eugene's legs were out of order again, and he thought that he wouldn't be able to escape like this. Meanwhile, the dragon had gotten very close to him, preparing to kill him. Opening his mouth, he let out a monstrously loud roar, and drool flew from his mouth in all directions. Eugene closed his eyes tightly, awaiting his painful death in fear. But then something flew at the dragon, and a huge explosion thundered over his head. A figure grabbed the boy's body and put it away from the terrible monster. As it turned out, that man was Eugene's younger brother, Oliver, who was now holding his brother on his shoulder. Oliver carried his brother aside, placing him behind a rock to keep him safe. Eugene asked him what he was doing there, to which the boy only told him to stay behind. In response to this, Eugene only cried out that even he was not able to cope with the three-headed monster. But Oliver did not listen to his older brother's warnings, but only fearlessly turned to the dragon. Leaning forward, he said something, his voice barely above a whisper, activating his skill. And the blue willow leaves technique was activated, and many glowing leaves began to swirl around Oliver. Pushing off the ground, he jumped into the air and began to rush from side to side, striking with his sword. Gripping the blade tighter, he activated his other skill, and the blade of the sword began to glow with a dark light. With a wave of his hand, he stretched out the dark energy that flowed from the blade of the sword. The boy raised his hands, pointing his sword towards the monster, and dark energy swirled around the blade of the sword. Oliver threw a punch, causing a bright purple flash to erupt, illuminating everything around. Still sitting on the ground, Eugene watched the fight with interest, and he replied that the guy was very fast, looking at his brother, whose face had a serious, focused expression. He thought that this was a battle of the S-classes. But then Oliver's gaze darted frantically somewhere to the side. As it turned out, another dragon head appeared there, from whose mouth some kind of green liquid began to flow. and then this head spat out a funnel of this liquid, but Oliver managed to jump aside in time. Eugene's cry was heard, exclaiming that it was a deadly poison, from which even a healing potion would not save. Meanwhile, this very poison was flying towards Eugene himself. In the blink of an eye, Oliver was in front of his brother, activating a shield to protect the two of them from the poison. However, small drops of poison still fell on the boy's body. Eugene called out to his brother in fear, but he only looked forward sternly, once again pointing his sword. The boy swung his sword, cutting off two of the dragon's heads with one blow. However, after this blow, the blade began to melt with a loud hiss. Eugene looked at the blade of the sword in panic. Not understanding why his brother was here, Oliver went towards the dragon again to kill it, and Eugene wondered if it was acting like that because it was protecting him and therefore could not fight freely. Realizing this, the boy leaned forward to call his brother. Turning around, Oliver asked the guy why he went into the dungeon again. Was even a broken leg not enough to stop him? The guy screamed about how he was climbing without knowing his place and what it all led to, how long he planned to make him clean up after him. Oliver shouted at him irritably that he had already told him so many times to keep out of his way and live quietly. After a few moments, Eugene quietly asked if he had come here just to say that. Getting to his feet, he said that he had been wondering why he had come, and that he was afraid of being tied up by him again. Oliver shouted for him to go back to the corner. Everything inside Eugene froze, and he wondered if he really thought that he had come to save him just because he was his brother. The dragon flew away with a loud cry when Eugene asked if his brother was tired of it. He slowly dragged his feet along the ground as he walked forward. The boy raised his hand, under which a sword shone, and he asked if it irritated him that his older brother was always butting in, not knowing his place. Eugene said that his brother didn't have to come at all, because everything could have been done more simply. Turning around, Oliver screamed again for him to retreat, but Eugene didn't seem to hear him, and he just ran forward with a sword in his hands. Running up to the monster, he thrust his sword into its body. The dragon's head turned towards him when Oliver asked him what he was doing. Eugene released his grip and the blade fell to the ground as he asked if this was how it would end. The guy said resignedly that he would save him again, and he would become his shackles, so why not leave him here to die? He frowned, saying that for him, as for the one who died in the dungeon, there would not even be a need to arrange a funeral, and he himself thought that he was mortally tired, and then wondered when it had started. The dragon's mouth flew at the guy when he said that everyone would be happy with the abyss, so there was no need to worry anymore. Eugene spun around again, preparing to accept his death. Oliver, with a loud cry, quickly rushed to intercept. The monster's clawed paw almost closed on Eugene's body as Oliver flew towards him. Everything around was illuminated by an explosion of the guy's dark energy. Drops of blood fell to the ground. Eugene's eyes widened, realizing he didn't feel any pain, and then he looked away. His brother lay next to him, his back pierced by the dragon's claws, causing bloodstains on his coat. Oliver and Eugene were brothers who had no one else, and especially after the death of their parents, they had no one. Little Oliver, looking at his brother's lifeless face, asked him if he was all right. Eugene looked at the boy and smiled a weak smile, saying that everything was fine. In the whole world, they were the only ones who had each other. Meanwhile, the blood was increasingly ordered to the ground when Oliver asked his brother if he was okay. Eugene looked at his brother, trying to ask him something, but his voice was trembling traitorously. Meanwhile, one of the dragon's heads was engulfed in flames. The dragon, feeling extraordinary pain, opened its mouth, letting out a deafening roar. Coughing, Oliver sat up to tell his brother that Rauchidus fell asleep every 5 hours, and if he hid, he would fall asleep. Breathing heavily, Oliver turned to look at the monster and weakly told his brother to take advantage of the moment and run. Eugene thought that this couldn't be, because he had never visited him in the hospital when his leg was crushed. When he just wanted to help him, he pushed him away in the coldest possible way. He abandoned him, told him to keep a low profile and live quietly. And then he wondered why his brother was smiling at him now, holding out some stone. The boy put a stone in Eugene's hand, saying that with it he would be able to get out. And then he leaned forward heavily, falling into his brother's arms, saying that first they must take care of his wounds. Leaning on his brother, Oliver said that there was no point in this, and Eugene, hearing this, froze. Oliver looked at his brother's face with a smile, saying that he would not be able to use the gatestone. And then his hand loosened its grip and fell down. Oliver's body went limp, his head falling onto the shoulder of the guy holding him by the shoulders. A few moments later, Eugene called out to his brother, and the lights immediately began to flicker. Everything began to be illuminated by the light of these little lights, which became brighter and brighter. There have been reports that the educator effect is being displayed. The duration of the additional skill, Final Retribution, is 1 hour. Eugene's tears began to flow as his brother's skills were transferred to him in bright flashes. A whirlwind of shining flashes engulfed Eugene, who was holding his brother's body in his arms, while the dragon was preparing to attack again. And then, something shook the earth. The dragon's huge paw hit the ground, destroying it and shaking everything around. Embraced by the soft blue glow of the blue leaves, Eugene, with his brother in his arms, rose to his feet and then flew higher. When the earthquake ended, he landed back on the ground. Cursing, Eugene hugged Oliver's lifeless body tightly. His brother's dark energy glowed around his fingers. And then, from Oliver's chest, his shining blade appeared. Eugene took out the weapon and carefully laid his brother's body on the ground. He pressed himself against him again, holding the weapon out in front of him, saying that even now he was doing this to him. The enraged dragon rushed forward, and the guy just calmly rose to his feet. As the dragon came even closer, Eugene quickly jumped up, striking the weapon at its neck. Looking down, he noticed that it was too slow, and then he swung his spear, causing everything around him to become illuminated with a bright light as he cried out that he had twice the strength of his incredible brother. Eugene struck, and the dragon, bleeding, began to fall to the ground. And again memories began to penetrate the boy's head, and his brother said that since he had awakened as an F rank, he could not contact him. He thought about keeping him away, even further than he was now. If his brother became his weak spot, they would definitely target him. Meanwhile, Eugene rushed forward again. Rising again, the dragon met the guy with an angry cry and he only pushed away from his head. He jumped high into the air, throwing his spear arm back, and then he turned around to strike. In his mind, he had a picture of his brother's upbringing, where he told his subordinate to continue to observe and report. He said that by becoming a hunter, his brother would not be able to be properly protected by the law. When Eugene ended up in the hospital, Oliver blamed himself for not being able to stop it. He ordered his subordinates to deal with these bastards at all costs who did this to his brother's leg. In a bright flash, Eugene flew down, striking the dragon's food. Memories appeared again, namely about the day when he came to ask the doctor for help. Oliver ordered his subordinates to make it look like he was forced to help him financially just because they were brothers. Oliver pressed himself against the window, quietly saying that it would be better this way, because he would not go to the dungeon anymore. And then he sat down on the floor, exhausted, apologizing to his brother and praying that he would not go to the dungeon again. Finally, everything in the dungeon became quiet. It started to rain, and Eugene stood astride the huge carcass of a dragon, which was now definitely dead. The guy smiled weakly, asking who the bastard thought he was without even saying a word. Tears were streaming down the boy's cheeks as he leaned on his spear and said that he hadn't expected this. He had really broken him, tying his hands and feet. He noticed that the time of the last retribution was ending, and when time runs out, he too will die from the poison of Raucatus's internal fluids. The guy started thinking about what he had done if only he could change everything. And then a message appeared saying that an impossible achievement had happened. He had killed the dragon. A message has appeared stating that the legendary title Dragon Slayer is being awarded. The reward is 10 gate stones, 5 acquired Class 1 liquids, and the Great Sword of the Scarlet Dragon. And also a wishing stone is given out, which can fulfill any one wish, and a strange stone began to shine in front of the guy. Eugene stared at him in amazement, asking if he could really do anything. He then rushed forward to ask for his brother to be resurrected. But before he could finish speaking, a message appeared stating that the stone would do anything except resurrect the dead. Eugene fell to his knees, holding the stone in his hands, and he asked in a panic what he should wish for then. He wondered if he could become stronger than Oliver if he wished for it. He will be able to become what he wanted to be for so long, and maybe even more. But then he asked the wishing stone to turn back time, to return him to a time when his younger brother had not yet died. Eugene stood up, holding the stone in his hands. He said that he would no longer go to the dungeons and would live quietly, so let him return it in time before he woke up. A message appeared asking the guy if he was sure about his desire. Eugene's gaze softened, and he replied that he was sure his face was illuminated by the soft light of the wishing stone. And then the stone began to glow even brighter, and steam began to emanate from it in all directions. Eugene calmly closed his eyes, thinking that even if he regretted it, he would not allow something like this to happen again. And the next moment, Eugene jumped up, his eyes wide open. As it turned out, he was no longer in the dungeon, but sitting somewhere on the couch. Looking around, he realized that these were his brother's rear guilds. Looking at his body, he asked if he really had returned to the past. Taking out his phone, he looked at the date and noticed that he had gone back 5 years, and then wondered why he was in the Abyss building. And then he realized that he had hit the day when he found the Awakening Broker. He went, not suspecting that it was a scam, took the money with him, and then he was grabbed and dragged into the abyss. He thought that he would be able to catch up with his brother as soon as he woke up. Eugene leaned against the sofa, suddenly realizing that he was going to come here now. And at that very moment, someone's footsteps were heard outside the door. And then the door swung open, and a guy came into the room, telling his brother what he said. He asked him how much more he needed to repeat before he would allow himself to end up here. Eugene looked at his brother, his eyes immediately becoming moist. The only word that rang through his mind was back, as he rushed forward towards the boy. Eugene jumped up, wrapping his arms around his brother. Not understanding anything, Oliver called his brother. Eugene pressed himself against the guy, thinking what a relief it was that he was alive. And then he said a quiet, "Sorry." Without looking up, Eugene said that it was his fault. He had behaved so unreasonably. Oliver's eyes widened slightly as the boy continued, saying that he was sorry for both. For everything. Still dumbfounded, Oliver asked Eugene if he was going to get into more trouble, to which his brother shouted that he was not. And then he reached up to put his hand on the back of his brother's head, and he said he just thought about it on his way here. Eugene put his hand on the back of the boy's head and pulled him close, saying that he was only 20 years old now. And all this time he suffered so much alone and in the guild, and he, as the older brother, was long overdue to understand this earlier. Pulling back to look into his brother's face, Eugene said that he wouldn't make such a fuss anymore. He wouldn't give him any more headaches. Having recovered a little from the shock, Oliver hesitantly placed his hands on his brother's back, and he thanked him for these words. Eugene blushed a little and thought that this was such a relief, even though he felt a little ashamed now. He was glad that at least now everything could be returned back, and they were brothers who had no one but each other, and so they will remain. Eugene, again moving away from his brother, put his hand on his shoulder and with a joyful smile said that he loved him. He thought that now he would forget about awakening and the hunters, and would just sit quietly in his place. But then a message appeared that the recording of the awakened Eugene was complete. There were reports that the titles of Dragon Slayer and Ideal Educator were obtained. The additional skill, My Baby is the Best, was launched, and the growth rate of Oliver's fosterling was increased by 2 times. After a while, there was a saucepan on the stove in which something was cooking, and a frying pan in which eggs and bacon were being fried. Oliver, who was wearing an apron, turned to his brother and said that everything would be ready in a moment, so he should sit quietly. Eugene responded almost immediately, saying that he would do so. Sitting at the table, the guy felt this awkward atmosphere that was weighing on him. Earlier that day, before going back in time, they had another fight and Eugene simply ran away. Turning back, the guy stared at Oliver's back and thought that it was good that they made up. But he never expected that they would have dinner together. And then he thought that there was something more important right now, and he pointed his finger somewhere in the air, activating the status window. He thought about how he never expected to wake up again, and not like before. He was also surprised by this strange title of L-Class Dragon Slayer. He thought that he must have received it for killing Raucadus. However, why, when we went back in time, everything didn't turn out as if what happened had never happened. And besides, L-Class must mean legendary, which is even higher than S-Class, and Eugene poked at the icon of this rank. And then 4 round icons flew out from this rank, which belonged to his new skills. Among these skills were Poison Resistance, Curse Resistance, Fear Resistance, and they were all L-Class, which gave the guy resistance to legendary class poisons and curses. And there was also the SS-Class skill, Raucadus Predator. Assessing his new skills, Eugene wondered if he had become stronger since going back in time. Pictures of how everything could happen now immediately began to flash through his head. In the boy's fantasies, Raucadus was so strong that even Oliver admitted that he would not be able to cope with him, and that this was the end. But then he, the great Eugene, appeared before the guy, covering his brother with his body. Smiling, Eugene turned around and said that his brother had arrived, so everything was okay now. And then he said that this deadly poison was just a refreshing shower for a true hunter, and Oliver was stunned by his brother's coolness. Eugene thought that now he would become the strongest hunter and would be able to live like a king. And then he enthusiastically climbed into the status window to see what class he had become, expecting L or S class. However, for such high classes, his stats were too low. All of them were within 10 points. The guy noted with annoyance that he had become an F class again, and that he had no chance of defeating the dragon. He desperately grabbed his head, lowering his head to the table, and thought about how his body remained the same. How could he use all these skills? Looking again at the status window, he thought with disappointment that there was nothing unusual about him in this life either. His E-class agility and intelligence-enhancing skills are also similar to his previous skills. However, he noticed that his rank of educator had changed to L-class. By clicking on this title, he again summoned 4 skills that were highlighted in red. These skills were the L-class Last Gratitude, which Eugene decided was best not to use, while the other skill names seemed too disgusting to the guy. One of them was the skill My Baby is the Best, which provided accelerated growth of the object that was influenced by hearing the code word. The duration was 3 days. Eugene reasoned that this was very similar to the previous educator. And then he noticed in surprise that this skill accelerated the growth of the subject by as much as 2 times. He cried out in surprise about this, which made Oliver turn around. The next skill was the skill Our Child is So Incredible, which was activated by supporting the object of nurturing with a code word in front of more than 5 beings with intelligence that could perceive code words. And then the abilities and effect of the skills of the object of education increases relative to the number of living beings with intelligence, maximum 100%. Eugene thought that if he supported his brother in front of 50 people, he would become 1.5 times stronger, and if in front of 100, he would become twice as strong. And then with this skill, it's only a matter of time before he makes his brother the strongest. And not only him, but also the people in his guild. He began to fantasize about how he would raise the strongest hunters in the world and be able to bathe in money and adoration, to be at the top of this world. However, it turned out that the code word was love. Now Eugene began to bang his head on the table, not understanding why he had been given such a terrible code word. But then he realized that it had changed during his confession of love to his brother. Then the guy immediately thought about what would happen if he used this code word. He realized in despair that not only would he be considered strange, but he would also be arrested. Then he thought sadly that all these skills, considering the code word, were no good, and he couldn't use them, although the skills were quite good. The last skill Eugene decided to look at was Promising STEM. This skill was that he could check the supposed class of unawakened people, and subjects exposed to the code word could awaken with optimal talents. Eugene was busy thinking about how he could use such a skill, while Oliver finished cooking and put the pot on the table. He put some rice in a small plate and handed it to his brother, asking if he had enough rice. Eugene accepted the plate with joy, thanking his brother, and said that he would eat it all with pleasure. And Oliver, sitting down at the table, said that he cooked from what he had, so he did not know how it turned out. When Eugene tried the first boat, his face immediately lit up. And then he quietly said, not believing that it was very tasty. Oliver replied that he was then glad. And then, looking at his brother with a smile, he told him that there was still a lot left, and therefore, if he wanted more, he could safely ask. Continuing to devour Oliver's cooking, the boy said that he didn't even know his brother was such a good cook. Oliver replied that he had gotten the hang of it over the years, cooking for himself, and then Eugene asked him why he cooked for himself, since he had a lot of money. To which Oliver replied that it was much safer. Now there are various detoxifying and curse-removing items, but before there weren't any. Hearing this, Eugene froze. After a few moments, he quietly asked his brother if there were people who added Yal to his food or put curses on it. Oliver smiled sadly and simply said that he was performing alone and was therefore being held back. Other guilds grew by colluding with large corporations, but he did not join any and declared that he would create his own guild. Oliver said it would be a lot easier if he obediently walked into the appropriate guild. But then Eugene grabbed his brother by the cheeks, turning him around and interrupting him. Eugene cried out, asking why he, the bastard, had never told him about this before. Oliver, in response, looked away and told his brother to remove that expression from his face because he himself chose this path. And then he said that one thing tormented him, namely, that because of his behavior their relationship worsened. He followed him and interfered in every matter, trying to make sure that he did not catch their eye. He constantly deliberately distanced himself, afraid that they would touch his only brother. Eugene put his hand on his brother's shoulder and exclaimed that he should have just said it, to which his brother replied that he didn't mean to burden him. The smile fell from the boy's face as he continued, saying that he then felt like he wouldn't understand. And then he said that it turned out he was wrong, and he reached out to put his hand on the hand that was on his shoulder. Smiling again, Oliver said that his brother still thought about him and cared about him, and he also apologized and said that he loved him. The boy smiled brightly and happily, thanking his brother for saying so, despite how cruelly he had behaved. Feeling awkward about the fact that he was about to burst into tears, Eugene began frantically putting food on his brother's plate, saying that there was nothing to thank him for, since it was because of him that he had suffered so much. Afterwards, they had a pleasant time at dinner, and Eugene thought how good it was that he turned back time. It was the best choice he had ever made in life. After a while, Oliver's phone beeped. The guy looked at it and said that he had work, so he needed to go. As he rose from the table, He said that he wanted to say one more thing before he left. As he took off his apron, he told his brother to delete the broker's wake-up contact, and Eugene immediately reached for his phone. And the boy said that anyway, the broker wouldn't answer him now, even if he tried to contact him. As Eugene deleted the contact, he wondered if this meant his brother had gotten rid of those brokers, and Oliver watched closely. Oliver threw his coat over his shoulders and said that he would go now. Eugene waved his hand at him, saying that he would take care of the rest. Touching the door with his hand, Oliver asked him what he was talking about, and then he said that his brother would not go anywhere else. Smiling, he told him that now he would live here and would not have to go anywhere. Hearing this, Eugene froze somewhat frantically, comprehending his brother's words. And then he cried out, asking what this all meant. "He can't get out of here anymore?" Oliver, with a smile on his face, simply replied that it was dangerous outside and therefore he couldn't go out. Then, Eugene said that he walked around the area fine in the morning, there was nothing dangerous, scratching his chin. The guy replied that the situation was different from the morning. Now that they are close again, he is no longer as safe as he was before. He's been fine so far because he's kept him at a distance, but now his enemies are going to target him. There's no telling when they might try to take his life, so how can he let him roam around alone? With his arms outstretched, illuminated by a bright light, like an angel descending from heaven, Oliver said that from now on, his brother would only be here. And the next second, Eugene jumped out of his chair, screaming that he was crazy, and he quickly ran to the exit door. But suddenly bars appeared before his eyes, blocking his path, causing the guy to scream in fear. A voice called his name from behind him, and Eugene let out another cry of fear. The man handed the guy a document, and he said that they had transported everything he asked for here, and then asked him to sign the document. People immediately appeared and began to bring in boxes with Eugene's things, and Oliver said that even if his brother went home, there was nothing there. Now this was his home. A frightened Eugene screamed, asking his brother what he had done here. In response, the guy simply asked what was wrong with that, and then he said that he himself said that everything was fine. His brother apologized, said he loved him, accepted everything he had done so far. Oliver scratched his nose and said it was like he had gotten permission from his brother. Eugene's face darkened with annoyance and despair, and he thought about how this could mean something like that. After some time, Eugene was lying desperately on the floor among some of his things, scattered on the floor in boxes. Thinking about his brother's overprotectiveness, he wondered why he was acting like this, and if it was a side effect of going back in time. But then he came to his senses and, rising from the floor, he exclaimed that this was not the most important thing now. He began rummaging through the boxes of his belongings to grab the essentials and escape before his brother returned. Throwing his backpack over his shoulder, he walked towards the door, thinking that if he made a mistake, he would spend his whole life locked up. But, opening the door, he noticed that a huge man was standing in front of it, and the guy did not stop right away. The man frowned and asked the boy what he wanted. Eugene grabbed the door with his hand in fear and quietly greeted the man. As it turned out, the man was Steven, an A-class void hunter and Oliver's confidant with a powerful defensive skill. Eugene asked him if he would step out of the way for a moment, to which Steven replied that he could not, and his tone was such that there was no arguing. Steven put his hand out, pressing it against the half-open door, blocking the passage, and he said that the chief had ordered that they watch him so that he did not get out. Still, Eugene did not calm down and began to try to leave, shouting that he was only going for a short while, to which Steven, blocking his way, shouted back that he couldn't. The guy asked him what difference it made to him where he went. In response to this, the man only tiredly rubbed his face and sighed. He put his big hand on the guy's shoulder and said he wouldn't talk much, and then he told the guy to obediently return to the room, otherwise he would push him there, and a terrifying energy began to emanate from the man's body. The boy's entire body shook under Steven's large palms that lay on his shoulders, and he only made a strangled sound. He thought about it. It was as if he was suppressing his entire body, this special feeling of fear. In short, released by high-level hunters, he was like a herbivore standing in front of a predator. Still shaking, Eugene began to tell himself that he shouldn't be afraid. And then a message appeared that fear resistance was being activated. Suppression was cancelled. The skill began to take effect, and Eugene noticed that thanks to the skill, his trembling had disappeared. There were faint flashes of blue in Eugene's eyes before his fear disappeared completely. And now he thought that the formidable Steven now looked not like a predator, but like a meek puppy. And now, Eugene went into mad rabbit mode, and he grimaced, ordered the man to let him go, and then asked him what he was doing. Poking him in the chest with his finger, he asked him if he didn't know the laws of the Republic of Korea. And then he said that every person has the right to freedom, so locking him up here is a crime. He said that they really should go to the policeman's uncle, but then Steven grabbed him by the collar of his t-shirt. Lifting him off the ground, he said it was a punishment, and then he asked the boy if he wanted to be dragged to his room, to which the now resigned Eugene replied no, and then he apologized. He thought with resignation that, with or without skill, he was nothing. Steven began to push the guy back into the apartment, but then he hit the walls with his hands and feet. He began to frantically go through various options, thinking that he had so many skills, so he could do something. His gaze caught on the skill promising cutting, and the boy activated the skill. And then the guy turned around, grabbing the man by the face, and Eugene screamed, asking what was that there. Looking at the confused man's face, he saw his possible awakening level, his skills and characteristics. Eugene was surprised to find that Steven's possible awakening level was AS, meaning that there could be 2 S-class hunters in the abyss. Eugene began to pull the man by his ears and hair, thinking how pathetic it was. Couldn't he change it somehow? A message appeared stating that when raising an object in an incomplete state, after using the code word, it can use "my baby is the best" and obtain the S-class skills that were failed to obtain. After reading this, Eugene thought that he could solve the problem through education, because if he educated a man, then he would seem to obediently obey him. Having calmed down, Eugene decided to take advantage of this opportunity. But then he remembered that he needed to say the code word love. Steven's face looked extremely irritated when he asked what he was doing. You clearly can't tell someone like that you love him. But Eugene decided to try his luck and told him to look here. And then he decided to make a heart with his fingers. Steven looked at him in bewilderment. Then the guy decided to double his efforts and made a heart with both hands, and Steven started to get irritated again. He threw the guy into the apartment, telling him to stop these unpleasant gestures and come back, and Eugene mentally prayed that they would change his code word. A few hours later, it was already evening. Oliver entered the office. Looking at his brother, who was lying on the floor, he asked him if he had rested well, to which he replied that he was dying here. Picking his brother up from the floor, he asked him if he should move into his apartment since he didn't like it here. And then he said that he would give him a room. Eugene answered helplessly that he didn't care, because he would be locked in anyway. Oliver just sighed, and then he told him to cheer up, because he would soon let him out. Hearing this, Eugene really perked up, and he asked animatedly about when he could go out. Oliver awkwardly scratched his cheek and replied that the abyss was currently being held back by many enemies, but if they became the strongest, that problem would go away. So his brother needed to wait until they became the strongest. Eugene thought with annoyance that this would take several years in the future. Oliver took his brother's hand, saying that in a year he would already sweep away everything in his path, while Eugene, giving up his spirit, thought that it took more than 3 years. Meanwhile, Oliver continued by saying that sometimes he would let him go out, but only with Steven or him as security, and Eugene thought that it was like walking a dog. But then Oliver thought about the fact that it would be difficult to do this often, because he spends several days clearing dungeons, and he won't be able to trust it to anything below B class either. And then Eugene wondered if there was anything he could do about this with his abilities. A long time ago, he spent all day searching for information related to hunters, and so he clearly remembers who will become a high-ranking hunter. If he goes to them and appeases them, he will be able to awaken them, and as payment for awakening, he will make them his guards. If this way he becomes more authoritative, then Oliver too will be able to do whatever he pleases. And then Eugene happily jumped up and said that he would find an A-class hunter. Oliver just stared at his brother. Eugene was filled with the desire to find all the future hunters for himself. And since this is how it turned out, he needs to look for small children who are easy to convince. He will appease them well and raise them to be his personal hunters. Kneeling down, Eugene spread his arms, saying that he would find himself some A-class bodyguards, and then he should give him freedom. Then Oliver asked him how he would do it. In a panic, the guy began to talk about how he had different methods. Suspecting something, Oliver asked his brother if he had awakened. He ran up to him, asking various questions about his skill of being able to search for high-ranking hunters, worried that he would now be targeted even more. Eugene thought that he must not tell the truth under any circumstances, otherwise he would end up in eternal confinement. Giving up, he revealed that he was only an F-class. He said that he can determine the strong and weak class of the supposed awakening, and cannot do more than 1 awakening per month. Oliver reasoned that this would prevent his brother from becoming a target. And then he said that an alternative would soon appear, namely, a center for awakening, and the mechanism had already been revealed. Eugene scratched his face and realized that the center was not yet open at this time. And when he appears, then any person will be able to safely awaken, then the number of scammers will decrease, and there will be no people who could benefit from his skill. Smiling, Eugene quietly noted that everything had worked out well. He smiled happily and said that it was a useless skill, so there was nothing to worry about, and therefore he should just give it a chance. Oliver had already promised to give him freedom, but then he changed the subject, suggesting that they decide where he would move, and Eugene just jumped up happily. He thought that his brother wouldn't be able to keep him locked up because he would wipe out all the S-class hunters. He will quickly find them and grow his power, and so he will even be able to create a guild more serious than the Abyss. The next day, they went to the South Korean Association, the place where the Awakened were registered. People began to turn around, noticing Steven, the Shield of the Abyss. Steven walked ahead, attracting all eyes, and Eugene walked behind. People started whispering about who was walking next to Steven and whether a new S-class had appeared. Within minutes, Eugene was registered as an F-class hunter. Eugene and Steven walked back, hearing discussions about why the guy was pretending to be an S-class. The guy thought that he had done the most important thing, so now he just had to pick up the equipment, and he looked at the envelope with money from Oliver. When he saw the amount of 1 billion won written on the envelope, he was so surprised that his eyes widened. Soon, he went up to the 6th floor where the hunting mall was located. He was immediately greeted by friendly consultants who asked him what equipment he would start with. They equipped him with various ability-enhancing equipment that looked like fancy jewelry, and then Eugene asked if they had anything simpler. Then he was offered Dark Elf earrings that increased mana by 29 points, and Eugene decided to buy himself these earrings. He also acquired simple leather gloves, which increased his stamina and strength, as well as a light belt, which increased his agility. Looking at the status window, he noticed that he now had C-class abilities. He quietly said that now he would use the remaining money to buy a contract, potions, and something else. But then Steven, who was standing by the car, asked the guy where he had gone. Having got into the car, Eugene reported that he had gone shopping and asked whether he was now not allowed to do that either, to which the man replied that he had to report where he was going. He said that since there was nothing else to do, they were going back. But then Eugene asked him to take him somewhere else. Looking out the window, he thought that the ice witch Penelope lived somewhere in this area. She lost her parents and lived with relatives who owned a meat restaurant. Penelope was an excellent hunter, even among Class A, so this level should satisfy Oliver. She awakened at 18, but she is still in middle school now. The guy thought that he needed to find her as soon as possible, sign a contract, and regain his freedom. It was already evening on the shopping street, and the lights of the shops were shining brightly. Eugene began asking people if they knew Penelope. However, everyone said that they didn't know the girl. Looking around, holding a corn dog in his hand, he said that there were more meat restaurants than he had expected. Would he really have to visit them all? He started to think about when all this would end, but then he smelled fried meat. Steven said that he was interested in why he came here, because there are meat restaurants near the Abyss, to which he only replied that he felt a strong energy here. The man muttered that it was all a scam, to which the boy shouted that he could hear everything. He calmly walked forward, but then a girl came out from around the corner, shouting that, of course, it was all her fault. Hearing this, Eugene looked up from his corn dog and looked ahead, and the girl screamed, asking how many times she had to be told that it wasn't her, but that bastard newbie. A man looked out into the passage and shouted at the girl to think about where she had figured it out, to which she only pulled off her apron, shouting that she hated all of this. And then, screaming that it would be easier to die, she ran forward. Looking at the girl's face, Eugene thought that he had found her. He tried to stop her, but Penelope had already run far away. Eugene handed Steven his corn dog, asking him to hold it. And then he ran forward, thinking about where the girl got such speed from, since she had not yet awakened. The belt on the guy's body glowed with a dim blue light, and Eugene's body quickly accelerated, supported by the power of the equipment. And the guy ran through the streets, creating a wind behind him and thinking that the equipment was the best thing in the world. He ran through the crowd trying to find the girl with his eyes, and then he finally noticed Penelope, who was running a little ahead. And then he called out to her, asking her if she was Penelope, which made the girl turn around. Eugene told her that they needed to talk for a while, and Penelope stopped and asked if her uncle had sent him. And then she ran again, saying that she would not return, and Eugene shouted after her to stop. Penelope ran out onto the road, and immediately a car began to approach her, and the girl stopped. Before the car could hit her, Eugene ran up and pushed away from the car, pushing Penelope out of the way, and they tumbled head over heels along the sidewalk. The driver sat in horror behind the wheel of the already stopped car. The crowd stopped to look at the two. Eugene asked the girl if she was hurt, and afterwards he said that he would have liked the ending to be more exciting. As it turned out, Eugene was sprawled on the ground, and Penelope was sitting on top of him. And she asked him if he was really a hunter, to which he only told her to get off him. After some time, they reached a meat restaurant. Meat was frying with a crackling sound on the stove. Eugene exclaimed happily, saying that he hadn't eaten marbled beef for so long. He told Penelope that she was sitting opposite him and eating her fill, so that she could eat her fill, and he thought how good it was that he was paying with a co-op card. And then he asked her if she could eat there, since her uncle had his own meat restaurant, to which she replied that it was not tasty there, and advised him not to go there either. And then she said that he would rather tell her something else, and then she noticed that he told her that he was the elder brother of the Abyss. And then she asked why such a person needed her. Smiling, Eugene replied that it was because there was good energy coming from it. Getting up from the table, Penelope said that she didn't believe it at all and thanked him for the food. And then Eugene made up a story about how he knew her parents and they helped him when his parents passed away. The guy frantically began to tell her that, although he was late, he had come to pay off his debt. Otherwise, he felt so awkward. Chewing again, Penelope sighed and said that she didn't care, because she already had people who would wipe away her drool and give her a slap on the back of the head. While putting the meat on the plate, Eugene said that he was thinking about how to help her, and then his strength turned out to be outstanding. And he said that he had the power to awaken other people, and then he told Penelope that she could be at least a B class. Eugene continued by saying that he was also under the protection of the Abyss, so he could help her get a job there as a hunter. And he, if she doesn't mind, wants to become her sponsor. He extended his hand to her, asking what she thought, if she wanted to make a contract with him and become a huntress. Penelope looked at the man in surprise and asked if she could really become a huntress. Eugene thought that among teenagers this profession is considered the coolest. He thought that he needed to put on some kind of show to entice her, and blue circles began to glow above his hand. And then a shining roll of paper and a brush appeared in front of him, and the guy asked if the girl would sign the contract. Penelope jumped up from her chair and asked where he got it from, if he really had some kind of inventory. To which the guy replied that she could do the same, and that this contract was also a special thing, created from dungeon items. Having written something on it, he threw it to the girl. Having caught it, she looked at it with reverence, and Eugene said that all that remained for her was to sign the contract. Penelope read aloud a couple of conditions, which stated that she would have to make a contract with the Abyss to keep Eugene's skill a secret and be responsible for guarding it for a year. The guy said that he is just a weak F class, so he needs a bodyguard. But then Penelope asked him if he would be ashamed to be under the protection of a high school student. Eugene replied that after awakening, she would become much stronger than him. So no. And then the girl asked if she would be able to become independent after awakening. She looked sadly at the table when Eugene asked again, and then he said that it was generally possible, awakened minors on an equal basis with adults, and then the girl said that she would sign the contract. But then Eugene grabbed the brush that was in her hand, and then he said that everything needs to be checked, and her conditions are not yet in this contract. Eugene began to show her something in the contract, saying that this way she could have been deceived. Taking the contract, he said that the execution of the contract needed to be carefully monitored, so she still needed a guardian. And the girl's face immediately darkened. Eugene said that he shouldn't be fooled by the attractive independence. But then Penelope asked him about what if this guardian was deceiving her. Looking at the girl, Eugene asked what she was talking about. Looking away, the girl exclaimed that they would simply take everything away from her, instead of monitoring her performance. She clutched her shirt tightly in frustration and anger, and suddenly someone's cry was heard, asking where Penelope was. As it turned out, it was Penelope's uncle who shouted angrily that he had been told that she was here. Eugene stood up from the table to greet and introduce himself, but the man didn't listen to him, and only yelled at the girl for not doing what she should, and for also hanging out somewhere. He grabbed the girl's hand to lead her away, and then Eugene exclaimed, stopping the man. And then he grabbed his arm, stopping him. Finally, the man noticed the guy and he asked him who he was, how close he was with this girl. To which the guy replied that everything was not like that at all. Eugene squeezed the man's hand hard, and Penelope stepped back a little, rubbing her hand. Penelope's uncle began to shout to be let go, and Eugene turned to look at the girl. She stood with her back to it, frowning and looking somewhere at the floor. Her sneakers were so worn out that they were practically falling apart. Turning back to the man, Eugene said quietly that he now understood what she meant, and he asked her if she wanted to say that nothing was better than such a guardian. And Penelope actively screamed that everything was so, and her uncle was the worst. She pointed her finger at him and screamed that he had appropriated her parents' inheritance and was not giving her a penny for pocket money. She exclaimed that he once gave her only a cheap plastic umbrella, and when it fell apart she had to cover herself with a plastic bag. And people in the restaurant started turning around. The man frowned even more and said that she was always just disgracing people. The man pushed Eugene away from him and walked forward towards Penelope, and then Eugene suddenly fell to the floor. Penelope and her uncle stared at the boy in complete shock. Eugene was sitting on the floor when a worried Penelope asked if he was okay. And a moment later, Eugene began to writhe wildly on the floor, screaming that this uncle was beating people. He sat down on the floor and said that they could have had a normal conversation, so why did he push him? Tears streamed down the boy's cheeks as he said he just stopped the girl. Eugene continued his acting and cried out, asking if he was going to hit the girl too. Grabbing the guy by the clothes, he jumped up, saying that he was brazenly turning the situation around. But then Eugene tripped the man, and the man instantly flew forward face down on the table. Standing up, Eugene, holding a soda in his hand, said that they should be careful because the floors were slippery. There were crumbs of food on the man's face when he turned to look at the boy. But then Eugene again pushed the man face down into the table. He asked him worriedly if he had slipped again, while Penelope chuckled quietly behind him. Eugene brought the man's face to the grill, asking him how he was not ashamed to steal from a child. The man screamed in panic. Frowning, Eugene said that he would destroy him if he misbehaved with the girl again. Penelope exclaimed that this BAM sound was just like in wrestling, to which the guy said that this sound was not from him. And then, turning around, he noticed that this sound was coming from the street. And then Steven burst into the room. Meanwhile, something was happening on the street, causing people to panic. As it turned out, a huge black monster with many eyes burst out from under the ground. The monster opened its round mouth, from which some liquid burst out, as well as a deafening scream. People ran away in panic through the streets. As it turned out, there was a dungeon breakthrough nearby. Eugene and Penelope ran outside and Steven told them to move away because it was dangerous. The man, saying that he would stop him, pulled his hand back, and a hexagon began to glow on his fist. Then he hit the ground with great force, causing a bright beam of light to shine. And then the asphalt in front of him formed a high wall that protected them. And then Steven shouted for them to take advantage of the chance and escape. Eugene, in a panic, thought about the fact that there was nothing like this in his memories. So why did a monster suddenly appear? While the boy was thinking about this, Steven crouched down on the ground, telling them to leave quickly. And then he pushed off the ground and flying over the wall, flew forward. He swung his leg sharply, pushing the monster's black tentacles away from the wall. And then, with a bright flash, he landed right on the monster, striking it. However, the monster only went limp under the man's feet, without receiving any damage. And then he began to hit the man. There was another explosion, and people screamed that the monster was already climbing over the wall. Penelope and her uncle also ran away. But then the girl stepped on her shoelace, and then she fell to the ground. And the monster immediately quickly launched its black tentacles towards her. But before they touched the girl, she collided with something. As it turned out, it was Eugene, who was holding a shield. Turning around, Eugene cried out that they had to run. And then they ran away together. Penelope looked at the guy's back with a confused face while he held her hand. They ran to the entrance of the shelter, which was in the shopping center. The guy told her to come in, to which Penelope asked him about him. Eugene replied that he needed to go back. He thought that he had seen such a monster before. They were weak alone, so they moved in a pack. And if they were not quickly gotten rid of, they would become a complete headache. Since Steven specializes in defense, he does not have a separate attack skill, and therefore he is at a clear disadvantage in a battle with such a monster. Eugene thought that he had to find a way to help Steven at all costs. But then Penelope grabbed his hand and cried out that she would go too. She told him to wake her up and then she could go fight. Eugene exclaimed that he would not do that because she had not yet signed the contract, and Penelope asked him if he was afraid that she would go back on her word. And then she cried out that she would not do that, and besides, the situation was critical.